All right, everybody. Well, welcome to the TrustedSec Live webinar, the ransomware environment. Really appreciate everybody joining today to hear us talk for a few minutes and hopefully get things started. And there, we can see each other now. Great. So, hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining and coming along. We also have Scott Nusbaum here, which we'll do some intros here in just a second. But this one is obviously an important subject for all of us. If you look at what your threat models are for your organization, regardless if you're in financial, medical, whatever it ends up being, ransomware is a target that we're all concerned with. And if you look at kind of, the evolution of ransomware, which we'll definitely get into, and Scott will definitely dive into, the shifting tactics, techniques, and procedures that we see from these adversaries continuously make us have to evolve our security programs. And there's a lot of things that go into that. Everybody talks about, well, let's just do the basics. Well, the basics are hard and take a long time to implement. And we have to look at what we can do, proactively to really start to help out with a lot of these different areas around these different groups and capabilities that these different groups have. But we'll get into that as we go along. But again, I really appreciate everybody coming here today. My name is Dave Kennedy. I'm the CEO and founder of TrustedSec. Today is actually our birthday. I don't know if Nate planned this to be on our birthday, but over 9 years ago to today is when we first opened our doors in the basement of my house and quickly realized that the basement of my house with 3 kids wanting to kill each other upstairs probably wasn't the best idea. So I ended up getting a small building that was, one room building that, TrustedSec was kind of started out of. And now we have over 100 employees worldwide, working with some of the largest organizations out there today. So happy birthday, TrustedSec, and to all of the amazing people that work here. You're the best crew that I've ever worked with in my entire life, and just really humbled to be here as part of that. I'll pass it over to Scott. Scott, do you want to do an intro yourself?
Sure. I'm a principal security consultant, as it says there. Background is malware analysis. I pretty much am that crazy person who likes to collect all the malware and take it apart and figure out what's going on with it, and figure out how they wrote it and why it works.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. Just a couple quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. Not that that matters to you specifically, but it'll be a full replay will be available to everybody on our YouTube page. So we'll post this shortly after. So if you have to bug out early or something like that, don't sweat it. It's recorded. It'll go out there. Also, feel free to use the question and answers functionality within Zoom. More than happy to answer any questions that you have. Feel free to ask them throughout this presentation. We'll be answering questions as we go along, or we can, wait to the very end, whatever you all prefer. But ask questions. And Izzy Seprafy, man, good to see you here. Appreciate you hopping on. But again, ask any questions that you want to anytime, and we'll go from there. Just a quick intro around who TrustedSec is. We're an information security consulting company, really focusing on helping customers in our organizations get better with cybersecurity. We have a number of different areas that make up, who we are as an organization, and we really focus on all the different aspects around information security themselves. Everything from red teaming to penetration testing to source code analysis and application security. Scott's team, obviously, from the incident response side of the house. Everything from GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, helping folks with PCI, helping people build their security programs, helping people build defenses. Our whole goal and our whole mission is really to make the world a safer place when it comes to leveraging technology and security. And our team's definitely second to none when it comes to helping out organizations with their cybersecurity challenges that are there as well. So really appreciate everybody coming here, and what an amazing team to be talking about. So Nate went and got a whole bunch of pictures of me, and he basically said, hey, I didn't try to find non-flattering pictures of you, but if I found one, I didn't reserve myself from putting it up there. So I'm pretty sure he decided to get ones that were my eyes were closed and some other ones out there. But hey, listen, ransomware is a topic that we're all discussing, and just most recently with the latest JBS and Colonial Pipeline hack, I think I was on the news like 80 times, over the span of a week or two. I was exhausted. I remember taking naps on the couch, just trying to communicate the message out there around, what's going on, what we're dealing with from an adversary perspective, and ultimately what we need to do to kind of make things a little bit better. And, there's no question, if you look at kind of the evolution that we have to deal with, these attackers are leveraging the same types of models that we see from nation states. Now, their sophistication levels may not be as high as those types of groups, but they're continuously changing how they go after organizations, their targets, and ultimately, having a lot of success with what they do. And so for all of us, ransomware is a big concern, because obviously when you look at kind of the ability for one employee or one specific server to become compromised, and then from there leapfrogging and pivoting to other systems, they start to have a larger monumental impact on our infrastructure, our backups. All of those things become a major challenging point for us when it comes to how we look at our security programs, how we're building defenses to be able to withstand these types of attacks, and ultimately what we can do to make the world a safer place, right? And so ransomware to me is definitely a major concern for many organizations that are out there. In fact, Scott can attest. We have dealt with a number of these different groups on a regular basis. There's been crazy times, even when you start dealing with things like SolarWinds and the Hafnium data breaches. It's just, causes incident response obviously to kick in, but it's usually after the fact, after something's already happened. And there's a lot of things that we can do in our programs to make things, a lot better, a lot more resilient to these types of threats as we go along. Next slide. So Scott, I'll pass it over to you about what we'll be covering today, and kind of kick it off and go from there.
Yeah, big surprise. We're going to be talking about ransomware, if you haven't figured that already. So we're going to kind of talk about a little bit about just what ransomware is, a little about like what it can do, what it can't do. Basically, do we care who or what got infected you? We're going to look through some of the different types of paths that the attackers use to get it onto your systems. We're talking a little bit about some of the good things to do, the different trends to do inside ransomware, things that we've been seeing or have seen in the past, some things that we believe we're going to be seeing in the future. And then we're going to go through some recommendations, just things that we see that you can probably implement, or things that can do to help slow down ransomware or the attackers that are getting into your network that are launching the ransomware attacks. And I just want to say real quick, I apologize if there's background noise from my side. I had power outage this morning, had to hurry up and get to a place that I actually had internet and power. So sorry if there's too much background noise on my side. So what is ransomware? Everyone believes that if you ask anyone, they're going to be saying it's that thing that encrypts all your data. It'll move from computer to computer. Well, that's a ransomware attack. Ransomware itself is most of the time a very small, specific program that does nothing but try to encrypt the files on that local machine or that have a file share open. Some of the more advanced attackers will try to search for like open SMB shares, but vast majority of the actual ransomware just tries to attack what's on that current system. What everyone kind of, when they refer to ransomware, they think of the overall attack as being the ransomware. It's not. There's a lot of little different pieces that go into a ransomware attack. And normally the ransomware launching is one of the last stages of that attack. They still need to get access into your system. They still need to find what inside your environment is the most critical data to you or most sensitive, the most likely that you're going to pay. Then they need to figure out how to escalate privileges, get onto those systems, and then launch a ransomware. And the truth is ransomware, I think we can go on to the next slide. Well, so one of the questions that we almost get is, why did I get targeted? A lot of times, especially for smaller companies, you're not being targeted. You just happen to have somebody that clicked on a phishing, or you had, unfortunately, one of the first things we always ask is, did you have RDP exposed to the internet? They find some vulnerability or something to get into your system. And then from there, that's their initial foothold. It's almost like any other attack that the attackers will attempt. They need to get a foothold first. And for some of the larger organizations, they might be targeted, but for a lot of littler ones, it's more of an opportunity. They manage to get a foothold, or they purchased a foothold, and then from there, they manage to get in and move around your systems. One of the funny things that we also get a lot of times when we come in, they're like, well, I use Mac and Linux, so we're not going to pay attention to those systems. Well, they're just as easily encrypted. There are so many different encryption frameworks out there that you can just download and put into a program that will then encrypt. So having a Mac or a Linux, it does not protect you, but the I guess they want to say market share is lower, so there's not as many people attacking them. We have gone into incident response cases where they have targeted the Linux system, but they were more interested in encrypting the database rather than the actual system itself. That's something else that has been trending a little bit more lately, is if they can get access into the database, they will get in, and then the ones that we've seen, they've actually just deleted the database and then put their ransom note inside a table there. So this one I always think is funny from our perspective, is that, do you really care who's attacking you? Well, yes and no. By the time that you realize that you're under attack, especially a ransomware attack, a good number of your systems or files have already been encrypted. At that point, it doesn't really matter who's coming at you. But as far as why it would matter, is a lot of times these guys tend to use the same type of attacks. They use the same type of tools, or they use similar tools, they move similarly. So being able to identify who it is can help you try to move through your systems and identify if any other computer or laptop or server was compromised but hadn't had a ransomware leaked on it, ran on it yet. Also, it gives you an understanding of whether or not it's safe to deal with them. If you're dealing with a ransomware actor that has been known in the past for bad decryption software, incorrect keys, or just not getting back to you, are you going to be more likely to enter negotiations with them if you already know there's a good chance that you might pay and not get anything of value from them?
Well, Scott, that actually leads into one of the questions that Mr. Widget had. He said, of the various ransomware APTs that you've dealt with, what have you seen regarding their candor and what it's been like to negotiate with them, or their aggression, those types of things? And I know that we don't handle any of the specific payments per se, but having gone through some of those, what are your thoughts there?
So yeah, we don't actually handle the negotiations, but we've sat on the backside of it and have talked to the clients who, as they're going through it, to get an idea of what's going on. And one of the things is sometimes the ones that we've dealt with, they've been actually surprised with how business oriented they are. To them, it is a business. It's a very, very lucrative business. They want you to contact them and trust them to pay them. And also, kind of going back earlier, if it gets out that a ransomware is not easy to deal with, you're probably more likely not to pay them. From what I've seen, a lot of them will actually have some of them have pretty set up sites for you to go and figure out how to interact with them, how to figure out what the payments are. I know there are organizations out there that you can bring in that will do the negotiations for the actual payments.
Yeah, and I've been on some of those before in the past too, and it's really interesting. A lot of them you can negotiate down. So if they're requesting 4 million, you might be able to get it for 3 or 2. Usually not much lower than that, but they are generally, as Scott mentioned, very focused on the business aspects of the transaction. The only thing they care about is them getting that money. And as Scott mentioned, I think it's important to note that a lot of these groups, they care about the money aspect and making sure they can get their money, but not necessarily on the decryption side of the house. So a lot of the decryption tools that they use are pretty rudimentary or pretty crummy. They kind of work or don't work. But that's where going into and tracing back to the specific groups that are hitting you, whether or not you're going to actually get that data recovered, or if they're known for being able to recover that in the first place. Obviously, our suggestion is, don't pay the ransom, if you can, but obviously in certain situations where they have 90% foothold in your environment and they encrypt everything, I mean, it's your decision at that point in time of what you decide to do. Which leads me into a question from Darren. 4 states have bills in their legislature to make it illegal to pay ransom. Do you think this is the right direction, and will it encourage companies to address their weak security? And if the bills become laws, how do you think it will change the response to attack? And I'll tackle this and I'll pass it over to you, Scott, really quick. I think, when you look at what these organizations are built upon, it's monetary gain, right? So the thought pattern behind these types of bills that are coming out at a state level, not necessarily a federal level, is making it illegal to pay these ransoms, which would then cut off the funding to these organizations, and most hopefully would trigger a reduction in those types of attacks because they're not making the amount of money that they used to. We have some historical analysis around how this would work. If you look at the credit card market or the Carter market, it was a big booming business, especially around the Target, Home Depot, Jimmy John's, et cetera. Number of breaches that happened on the credit card data side of the house from scraping, clear text, credit cards from point of sale systems or back end server infrastructure. And when that avenue was eliminated, the Carter market essentially died. And don't get me wrong, it's still there, but the value substantially lowered, and the big bulk data heist that you saw before also lowered. And so that Carter market moved elsewhere, which is why we're in the ransomware situation we're in today. But in stating that, it's such a complex situation. So am I an advocate of basically using the law to prohibit these companies from paying? I don't know if I would go that far, because you're going to shut down organizations' ability to recover, which means that these organizations, who are the victims, by the way, these are victims that are being targeted by these organizations, they would have no ability to recover, essentially causing them to go out of business, and leaving them no ability to recover in the first place. So that's a tough pill to swallow. If you did it from a federal level, you gave companies, let's just say 6 months to stack up and shore up their security, and it was a big, national effort to really build defenses to go and do it, that could potentially work, but there would definitely be some short-term pain for hopefully long-term benefits. But I don't really see the federal government getting involved in going after the private sector that way. They typically like to stay out of private sector business. So I would say that the balance to that would be being much more overt against countries that house these organizations and holding them accountable for from a policy perspective, sanctions, et cetera, for these ransomware groups operating with impunity essentially in their individual areas, as well as really focusing on the cybersecurity aspects around protecting against ransomware. As we saw just most recently, NIST is now requiring a lot of their vendors to go through security scrutiny, especially from a SCADA or critical infrastructure perspective. While that's not going to be perfect in any way, shape, or form, hopefully we start to see critical infrastructure at least start to adopt some of these security practices. 87, or is it 80? I think it was 87% of our critical infrastructure is owned by private sector. So it's definitely going to be something where, listen, we have to take more responsibility for these types of defenses in the future. And I don't know if shutting that down from a payment perspective is the best option. There'd definitely be a lot of chaos, pandemonium, mayhem, and really just, completely shutting down these companies that wouldn't have the ability to recover, or, the ability to be more overt from an offensive perspective as well as defense. But Scott, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, you've mentioned most of the things that I was thinking about. We're dealing, from our side, we deal a lot with larger and smaller companies. The larger companies tend to have ability to actually recover from an attack because they have the backups, they have the infrastructure. So they're able to actually maybe get away with not paying the ransom and be able to rebuild, go back a couple days. Maybe they lose a little bit of work, but they're all right with it. A lot of the smaller companies, they don't invest as much into their IT departments or their security staff. And when what gets encrypted on that, if they don't get that back, they're out of business. So they get put in that really tough, hard spot, kind of like Dave was mentioning, is like, it's not only their business, but it's all their employees that are now out of a job if they don't get the data back. So it's a really tough decision to make on whether or not whether they have to pay, and if you make it illegal to pay, are they still going to find ways to actually pay it because they don't want to close their doors?
Yep.
So, go ahead.
Scott, go ahead.
I was just moving on to the next slide. So if you got something else you want to.
Nope, you're good. Go for it.
Okay. So generally, what does a ransomware attack look like? Normally, we kind of talked about it a little bit already. An attacker, from an IR standpoint, you normally hear about it first when somebody is basically waving their hands in the air going, I can't get access to my file. What happened? Then you start looking at it, and normally the first thing you'll do is you'll notice a ransom note. Normally it's like a readme.txt or some type of text file or an HTML file. Sometimes, depending on the ransomware, it'll pop up like a window on that system saying it's been encrypted. And normally they'll give you some type of message saying it's using advanced cryptography and there's no chance for you to break it. And as you start looking through, you'll find that more and more systems have been encrypted. But that is not the beginning of an attack. That is the very end of the attack. Because once the attackers start encrypting the systems, there's nothing else they can do from that system, or there's nothing else they can steal. So normally what actually happens is they get their initial foothold the way that almost any other attacker gets their foothold. Normally it's like a phishing, a vulnerability. Dave mentioned like the hafnium earlier on. It's some entrance into your network or into your environment that they can then use to pivot and move laterally, escalate privileges, get more. Their ideal situation would be to get access to like a domain admin or to some type of patch system. In a way you roll out your software, anytime you put out your patches, if they could take that over, then they can push out the ransomware to all systems and have the most devastating consequences. But the other things that we've also have seen inside some of the attacks is we'll see initial compromise weeks to months prior to the ransomware. You'll see like an initial compromise of a system. They'll come in, they'll prove that they got access to it, and then they'll leave. And then like weeks or months later, they'll come back in and be a lot more noisy. They're searching around, trying to identify things, look for data that's of interest to them. And then they'll start the encryption on their way out. So it's kind of changed. Something else that we've also noticed with that pause, the tactics that are being used inside that pause a lot of times have changed. So it kind of leads us to believe that somebody originally got compromise or access to your system and then possibly sold that access off to somebody else that then deployed the ransomware.
Hey, Scott, real quick, we have a question. And I'm not sure something you can answer here, but how someone had asked, Justin had asked, how prevalent is ransomware within data centers or AWS? Most of what I hear is user endpoints and things to that effect.
If they can get access to it, they'll encrypt it. Most of the time, it's easier to get access to the endpoints, but what they're really looking for is to encrypt your servers, file shares, things like that. So if you have them mounted into AWS, they'll go after it. A lot of times what they'll do is they get into your systems and they try to find anything that's of the most value. So if you house most of your stuff in AWS and they can detect that while they're doing reconnaissance inside your network, they'll try to find some way to get there.
Yep,
as far as any type of compromise in the cloud, those are always sarcastically saying fun from an IR side. Because there's generally no logging. Most of those, the cloud providers have very, very minimal logging, and to get access to those logs, it takes a while and it's difficult. So when we get called into an IR, especially a ransomware case, it's funny because we're normally not even out of the kickoff call, and we're already being asked, can I start recovering? No. Many of the systems you need to figure out, and this is one of the key things going through the IR process that you'll need to that needs to be done, is you need to figure out how did they get in to begin with. If you don't know how they got into your systems, they're either still in your system or they just get right back in if you replace things back to the same way they were prior to the ransom. So it's one of these, yes, I know your business needs to get back up as soon as possible and you're down, but we need to find out how to kick the attackers out and how to keep them out. Otherwise, they're going to come back in and re-encrypt you. And if it's in a certain case, this time they might be watching to figure out where you backed up from, and now they'll take out your backups. We can go on the next slide. So in most IR, you'll start off with like your normal IR phases, except for when you're dealing with ransomware. When you're dealing with ransomware, you don't want to figure out the analysis first. You need to actually start containing. and then move into analysis. So this kind of breaks the normal IR process. By containment, and we're going to say, okay, we get into a system, we know system X has been compromised, the ransomware has been released on that. Can we identify how it got released on that system? But first thing you need to do is isolate that system. It's nice if you have tools that will allow you to isolate the system from the network and leave the system running. But the wonderful catch that comes with ransomware is, can you afford to leave the system up and encrypting the rest of the files on that computer? So you need to have an understanding of what's available on each of the systems and what is their risk level. If you have a system that you cannot isolate, normally with dealing with malware, we tell you to leave it on until we can get you to do a memory snapshot. That way we can get a lot of key information, config files, things like that out of the memory dump. But in the case of ransomware, if you have stuff on that system that is valuable, you might want to shut down that system as fast as possible so that as the minimum amount of files have been encrypted.
Yeah, and just to Scott's point there, time to dwell is the biggest issue here. The more time that an attacker has in your environment, the more they're going to expand and potentially cause impact to your system. So, as you start to identify those systems as they come along, isolating and containing those systems without shutting them down is still allowing, the ability for memory acquisition or forensics analysis will be very beneficial, especially when you start looking at root cause analysis of, how specific entry points occurred, trying to trace it back to, shutting the attackers out and booting them out of the infrastructure, making sure you can get a clean recovery. But also, recognizing that the longer that they have in your environment, the more that they'll be able to do from a damage perspective. So, it's definitely that delicate balance when you're doing an incident response to make sure you kind of do both of those at the same time.
And we've worked cases where the clients have started doing remediation or recovery as we're still doing our investigation. There are ways to do it. You can do it, and we've seen them where they've actually have set up a completely new network or isolated network where they can start rebuilding and recovering their VMs or their bare bones servers. But they'll do it one at a time, and they have increased monitoring on each of those systems to look for any type of malicious traffic. That's one of the safer ways to do it. Something else that we always talk about, even if you pay the ransom and you receive the decryption keys, you're getting something from a malicious actor. It could be another way that they get into your system. So we always say that if you need to decrypt your files, take it into an isolated environment and decrypt them there, and then plan on basically burning that system down. Normally, if it's a bare bone thing, just re-image it, start over from scratch for once you're done, but always take caution with even the decryption tools that they provide. Something I like to do is I like to take and reverse engineer a little bit of the decryption tools to see if there's any type of extra beaconing or C2 communication that happens inside them. So this is also one of the things that we normally hear during the kickoff calls is we always have to ask, do you have backups? And most emphatically, a lot of times they go, yes, we have backups. And then you see them turn to the side and go, do we really have backups? And we have asked, the next question we always ask is, have you verified that your backups are still valid? And mostly all the time, they say no. A lot of times they no, we just set it up 2 years ago and we've never checked it. We've had cases where we've gone in and once they finally checked their backups, they found that they hadn't been working in months. So one of the things that we normally will bring in is saying, okay, inside your alerting and monitoring, do alerting and monitoring around your backups as well, so that if that transfer stops going for some reason, you get an alert to it as soon as it happens.
One specific area, and then we have a question kind of around that same mark. Someone had asked if you're able to recover from a ransomware attack, and you've confirmed no protected data was leaked, is it always necessary to contact law enforcement agencies from an IR perspective? I'll answer that with a short one, and then I'll pass it over to you, Scott, for more of one. But one thing I can say is that a lot of the ransomware groups are focusing very heavily on kind of a double whammy, where it's a combination of encryption as well as data exfiltration. So they'll copy all the data off first, usually to an intermediary server in the United States or somewhere local that they have a faster transfer speed, and then from there kind of offload it to a third stage server for that data transfer. So not only is it encryption of your infrastructure, it's also the data that's coming along with it as well. And so when you see those types of situations, you have to very much confirm that those types of things haven't happened. But Scott, I don't know if you have any additional pieces on the law enforcement side of the house.
So law enforcement side, we get in, and that's also another frequent question that we're asked during our kickoff calls is, should we involve the FBI? And that depends on the company itself and the material that's stolen. A lot of times when you're dealing with the FBI, it's very unlikely that they're actually going to aid in your investigation. The vast majority of the time, they will collect information about the TTPs that you have identified. They'll let you give them information, and they'll aggregate a bunch of different breaches and together. But it's very unlikely that they'll actually provide you with any information that could aid in your investigation.
Yeah, and to add to that, that's why it's equally important, not only from a ransomware perspective, is the backups and recovery, but also the protection of your data, right? Trying to minimize this from happening at first. So we'll talk about recommendations around what you can do from an organization perspective to fix a lot of these issues. But ultimately, if they've had access to your data for a long period of time, chances are they've already exfiltrated that data out, and then the ransomware is a secondary piece of that. So it's definitely much more damaging now than it was before.
So somebody put a comment about initiating the encryption efforts on a Friday before a long weekend. Sometimes they do that. A lot of the encryption software is really pretty fast, and it's multi-threaded, so that they can do, the idea is to encrypt as fast as possible. So a lot of times it'll be done overnights or over long weekends, like you kind of mentioned. But sometimes I've seen it done in the middle of the day. If they have the ability to get into your system and lock you out, this is some of the things that we'll get into a little bit later, but we have seen tools deployed first on the system once they've taken it over that will either change your password, or it'll run a tool that will actually lock your screen, basically like a screensaver password, where you can't get in to actually shut it down while it's encrypting. The best thing you can do at that point is basically pull the plug to the laptop or the server that's running. Some of them will, even if you try to through the screen or through your terminal interaction with it, try to tell it down, we'll actually hook those calls and not let you turn off the machine without actually physically pulling the power. So they can launch this at any time.
Hey, Scott, real quick, couple quick questions here. Someone asked, what is the recommended tool for performing a memory snapshot?
Honestly, anyone that works for you. We've bounced between a couple different ones in order to make sure that we get the one that we want that runs fast. What we're looking for is just a correct dump of it. Honestly, I'm all of a sudden forgetting off the top of my head the tool that we use. I'll have to look that up and get it back to you on it.
Yep. And then another question, this one is for me. Dave, can you touch on the nuance of inspiring the C-suite to invest before the breach? I continue to see the challenge of companies' willingness to really invest in security. If SecOps performs well, our work goes unnoticed. It's only when we fail the value of that being have been perching is recognized. Unfortunately, the scapegoat is already being walked out the door, mumbling, "I told you so." So I think listen, big breaches like JBS and Colonial, have definitely made a lot of awareness around the potential for these types of breaches. Unfortunately, we see these all the time, and we see organizations, that are completely, unprepared to handle these types of threats, and they're literally brought to their knees and they have no ability to recover. Right. And that's the most unfortunate thing. When you have the ear of your executive team, I think it's important to note that, you have to communicate in a way that they understand that, listen, there's some serious potential here for the entire organization from a risk standpoint, to be able to not recover, like your business is gone. And most organizations or most executive teams or boards, when they look at risk, there's a million different risks that they're dealing with. They're dealing with operational risks, supply chain risks. They're dealing with, personnel risks, all of these different things that make a business work in day and day out. And ultimately, it's our job in security to really communicate that level of risk of these specific things. This isn't us crying wolf 10 or 15 years ago. This is legitimate things that we see from time and time again, where every organization, every industry vertical, is potentially impacted by this, and making sure that you have the appropriate strategy and plan, to go through this is important. Now, if you want to go, a little bit down further, map out the adversary groups that are out there from a ransomware perspective that would be most highly probable of targeting your organization, and run through some emulation plans with those groups and say, hey, here's how protected we are. We literally can only spot maybe 4% of these specific attacks. So we're largely blind to these specific attacks as they happen. And we have a high probability of our entire operations being shut down because of that. I doubt any executive is going to ignore you at that point, especially coming back with some supply data. So I think it's a matter of the message that you provide to your executive team, and really communicating that in a way that they understand and represent that risk in a way that they can respond to that, to give you the appropriate staffing, funding, et cetera, to be able to address those. But listen, the time of not doing security basics and the time of not doing monitoring detection, it's over. I mean, if you're doing business and technology, you have to do security. There's just no other way around it. It's not me from a security perspective because I'm biased. It's literally you don't have the ability to recover from an organization perspective if you don't focus on your security program. So, those have to be discussions that you have, frankly, with your executives. And I was having those conversations when I was the chief security officer over at Diebold. Having those conversations with our board members resonated with them, and they're like, got it. What do you need? What can we do more of? What do you it was very receptive. And I think having those frank conversations make a big difference. Sorry, go ahead, Scott.
To go back, the tool that we use is actually the WinPMem to do the RAM acquisition.
Yeah, and there's quite a few. I know FireEye has Memorize and a few others. There's quite a few of them out there that do memory acquisitions. It just depends on the best tool for your job, right?
Yep. Even things like a bunch of the other different tools that will do endpoint detection, they'll also allow you to do remote memory acquisitions along with isolations. So if you have those in place already, use them. Something that we've done recently during tabletops, as we're walking through different clients, we'll ask, okay, good, you can do the memory acquisition remotely. Have you done it? And they're like, well, no. Last time we tried it, it didn't work. Well, the normal suggestion then is try it again until you can get it to work and you know how it works, then document that. Somebody mentioned something about many victims proactively disconnect systems when the ransomware is triggered. When it's triggered, disconnecting or turning off, like we kind of talked about, will possibly save you some encryption. If you walked in after a long weekend and the ransomware has been running all weekend, we would actually suggest at that point saying leave the system up and running, but isolate it from the network. That way we can do a memory capture on it, because at that point, the damage is already done. So kind of got back to what we kind of talked about earlier as the should I pay? Again, from our side, we do not want to deal with, we do not tell our clients to pay or not to pay. That is a business decision on their side. We provide them with just the facts of, okay, we try to provide them with the facts of this is where they got in, this is how they moved around, this is what they have had access to. And then it's the business decision to say, we can't recover from this. We need to look into or investigate the payment. And at that point, we normally will refer over to like a third party that will do like negotiations. Another comment is like, we normally will see when we're actually talking to clients is, should I pay? I don't want to pay. I don't want to fund these groups. But when it comes down to it, they might, especially on the smaller organizations, they actually have to start considering it, because depending on the level of the encryption, they might be going out of business if they cannot recover some of the data. So, sorry, I'm trying to read through some of the questions too at the same time.
And I'm responding to some of them as we go on too. We have a lot of great questions, which is awesome. One of the questions I saw there, Scott, was that I think you'd be good to answer is, I would like to enhance my skill set in threat hunting and remediation. How would you provide, do you know of any hands-on technical training for those types of things?
I do not know off the top of my head, but I got a few of the guys I work with they absolutely love threat hunt. So I can get with them and then we could try to post something up for you.
Yep. And threat hunting, definitely parlays very heavily into the incident response side of the house. So as you get more into incident response and understanding like what indicators of compromises are, looking through data sets, looking through various, techniques and procedures, or just, being able to comb through large data sets, looking for things, threat hunting definitely becomes that type of next evolution, I think, on the incident response side, to be able to go into. And at least for me, when I'm going on threat hunts, I apply the same type of offensive capabilities as I do to the defensive side. So I focus very heavily on things like Markov chaining, or, parent-child process relationships, north to south, east to west traffic, command and control beacon intervals, DNS requests, artifacts that might be left on the system, registry modifications, or things to that effect. All of those can be things that you typically look for. Every single command line argument, every single PowerShell command, some treasure troves in all of those different areas there. Any type of scripting languages or things that are going to be like living off the land, from a remote code execution perspective or download and execute functionality perspective. All ways that you can do, things that I typically look for on a regular threat hunt as I'm going through.
For me, the difference between the threat hunt and then IR is within IR, somebody's already breached. Where a threat hunt, you're looking for the clues. So it could be a little more frustrating if during a threat hunt, because there might not be anything there. It's always, for me, it's like doing like a CTF. There's a flag, so it's a lot easier to beat your head against it until you find the flag, because there's going to be one. But like Dave said, it's like the methodology that was the same as you would do during an IR, looking through all the different artifacts on the system for anything that could possibly be a sign of a malicious. Anymore, PowerShell has been so popular that if you see any type of encrypted blob of PowerShell, it's like, okay, that's almost immediately a flag of let's go back and look at that. So somebody asked a question about, have you seen much ransomware attacks on individuals? That's actually kind of a funny one. We get a lot more calls from individuals saying that people are being targeted or targeting them, and that they're going after them with different methods of taking over their phones and their laptops, TVs, and microwaves. But we've more seen the targets of like the executive levels as more of an executive level impersonation, where they're trying to use send a message that's appearing to be coming from the executive to somebody else that's lower than them in the company to try to make them click on it as your normal phishing attempt.
And I'll answer Henry's one. So why are cloud logs so limited? Shouldn't a company make this part of their analysis before moving to the cloud? Listen, I always made the argument that if you move to a cloud infrastructure, you should have equal or greater than visibility than the environment that you left. And that definitely has to be a discussion that you have, as you're looking at any type of cloud infrastructure or software as a service. Having logs that you can respond to from an incident response perspective, detect anomalies, look at potential misuse or abuse. Those are all key things that should be going into your cloud service strategy as you go along. And most folks don't go into that. They assume that the provider of that service is going to take care of the security aspects of things. And, again, this isn't a rip on Microsoft, but you look at, some of the defaults that you have, even for multi-factor authentication on Microsoft 365, you have to have a certain tier, premium level of Microsoft in order to automatically add people for two-factor authentication as a default. So there, Microsoft security defaults doesn't enable multi-factor authentication across the board. Now they do their behavior analytics, which means that if they notice some suspicious activity, it may trigger a second factor authentication, but that's far from a good stretch or application of multi-factor authentication. It's just, go ahead, Scott.
So you mentioned Microsoft's logs, and especially like M365, their logs, if you have like an E3 license, you don't have logs. They might have like the last 7 days worth of basic authentication, but if you actually want detailed logging, you have to go in and enable it. And then sometimes you even have to go up and buy like an E5 license in order to get like the last 90 days.
Chris Pruitt has one. Chris, good to hear from you. Hope you're doing well. Chris, good friend of ours over at TS. Have you experienced more and more ransomware as service, more ransomware as a service TTPs from your incidents, or largely are groups still full stack ransom development?
So from what we've seen, a lot of times we can track. It really does depend. We have seen ones where, yeah, we've seen that they got it through one avenue and it looked like they sold it off to somebody else, and then they came through and actually deployed the ransomware. Others, they get in and it's still a little bit more of the smash and grab. They get in on Tuesday, they do some light reconnaissance. Wednesday they do hardcore reconnaissance, and then Wednesday night they're releasing ransomware.
So one of the ones that I think we should answer, because we've had like 7,000 questions on it, and I usually like to wait to the very end, but we're coming up with some time here, is, what can we do to protect ourselves, either from a small to medium-sized business perspective, large organization? What security principles do you see on a regular basis that thwart these ransomware actors? I'll let you go first, Scott, and then I'll opine afterwards.
So some of the things that we've talked about that actually kind of help make it harder for them to get through is to disable PowerShell on the systems that don't need it. If you have a user that has no need to execute PowerShell, then why give them access to it? One of the other big things is disable RDP, especially from internet exposed systems. I don't know how many times we get into IR calls where we're using a tool like Shodan and we instantly find that they have RDP exposed. And it's like, okay, that's most likely their entrance. Some of the other things were like set up alerting on your firewalls or your egress filters that if a single IP is sending out multiple gigabytes of information that doesn't normally send out multiple gigabytes of information, flag it, because it could indicate that something's being exfilled. We've actually worked with a client that they happened to log into a server while the ransomware attackers were exfilling data to a specific site, and they canceled it. And it was 95% uploaded, because the way the site worked, when they canceled it, the attackers didn't get anything of the data exfil. So it could also be something like you set up a drop. So after so big, it just immediately shuts down a session. Something you could do at a firewall level. Some of the other things, just monitor all external facing systems. I don't know how many times you get called into investigations where there's just no monitoring on the items that are exposed. Password reuse. Things like that. Do not have shared passwords, or especially local admin passwords. Do not share them across multiple systems. One of the biggest things that we'll see or we want is find the root cause of a breach prior to saying everything's done or cleaned up. We need to understand everything that they have access to. We need to understand how they got access and how they moved around and how did they push out the ransomware. Did they use something like an SSEM, or did they use some type of sysinternals tool, a PS exec, to push out the ransomware and launch it? You need to figure it out, because that will also give you access to what credentials did they have. The other thing is when you can trace back if they compromise another system and now they still have some type of access into your systems that they just didn't release ransomware on, so you didn't think to recover that system. Testing. That's one of the biggest ones, is test against this type of stuff happening. See if your sensors can detect a system being encrypted. We've worked a couple places where they're like, I believe it was Varonis was the tool. They're like, Varonis will detect this and stop it. Well, try it in a safe manner. See whether or not it does. Know whether or not what you assume will work works. The biggest one is check your backups. Make it a regular thing. Make it a manual as well as an automated task to go in every so often and check your backups. Make sure that they're valid. Make sure that you can write to them, but you can't delete them without a special unique password. So only a specific password or user can go in and actually delete, which is different than the ones that are used to access it normally. So it's a lot harder to get that password to any type of modifications to it. The other one that is really good is to have an offline backup. So you take it to a tape drive and you put the tape drive in your drawer. It's a way to actually make sure that the attackers, if they've been in your systems for months, they don't know that that's there, and it's going to be very, very hard for them to actually corrupt that data.
Couple things to add to that. So Scott had mentioned, PowerShell. Well, we see PowerShell very much leveraged very regularly as the initial code execution method. So usually that's used for the initial stager. It'll go and download a second stage typically, and that's where you start to see a lot of the large infections. I would say predominantly a large percentage of ransomware groups use PowerShell. So, if you don't have the use for regular users using PowerShell, you can definitely minimize that attack surface for that payload being successful from an initial entry point perspective. There's a couple other things to hit on as part of this as well. These are some very tactical things that you can absolutely do. There's some other ones too, like for example, privilege use. Not having your regular users be local administrators, and that's a less common practice that we see nowadays in a lot of companies and organizations, which is a great thing. When you look at kind of the entire attack chain, and Casey had put a point here, is no admin rights the best control. I would say that there's no best control out there. There is definitely things to reduce, it'll make it harder for the attackers to get access. So if you look at kind of the attack chain, when an attacker goes after a system and they get remote code execution onto a system, what they're typically going to do is try to escalate the permissions. Now, if they're already an administrator on that system, then elevating your permissions is trivial. You're already running as administrator, and then it allows you to hook into the operating system, persistence, be able to extract additional information. But not having admin rights does not equate to not having a major substantial breach. There's a number of ways of getting access to various different systems, including privilege escalation onto the local systems that attackers can leverage at their disposal. That admin rights doesn't preclude. So it's not an end all be all by any way, but it's definitely a major control. Your users definitely shouldn't be running as local administrator accounts across the board. One of the big effective ones that I would say is really important. The isolation of systems from an architecture perspective is also really important from a defense in depth perspective. So, can we contain these things into smaller groups and minimize the damage of organization? For example, Scott had mentioned, check your backups regularly and offline backups. Is that backup infrastructure isolated and segmented? Can it withstand attacks from the user population side of the house into your infrastructure or server infrastructure? Is it isolated from your server infrastructure in case you see breaches in that environment? How can we start to contain systems that are less secure? Legacy, you have in manufacturing, you have shop floors, SCADA infrastructure from a critical infrastructure perspective or energy side. You have PLC, process logic controllers, all these different things that potentially can't be updated or used, or it can be abused very heavily for post-exploitation scenarios. Can we minimize and isolate those in a different architecture to allow us to still stay secure, but contain that breach to certain areas where there's potential compromise? So architecture has a really big difference of it. And one of the biggest, I think, things that you could probably do is disallowing regular users from being able to communicate to other workstations, especially on lower level protocols like RPC and SMB. When you look at most of these lateral movement things, they're happening at lower level protocols. So it's going to be 135 and 445 ports for spreading off from one system to the next. And so, if you can stop one user from communicating to the next user just by even enabling, the Windows firewall from a group policy perspective, you can configure through group policy saying if they're on the internal network, enable the Windows firewall. That makes a big difference from a lateral movement spread perspective, because now they only have access to one system. They have to now figure out how to breach into the server infrastructure and other areas to go through this. And that's assuming, obviously, that they go through a workstation environment. There's obviously server compromises, a lot of other things that you can do from an attacker's perspective. So I think, there's a lot of strategies around this. Some of the biggest efforts that I think Scott had said, multi-factor authentication is one of those that we see. It's crazy that there's companies out there that still don't have multi-factor authentication enabled. That's mind-boggling to me. That's, your users and passwords are going to be one of your weakest links. Please enable multi-factor authentication, everything, including VPNs, your Microsoft 365 accounts. If you have on-premise Exchange, same thing. Limit that attack surface as much as possible, and then start to look at, the last stage of this is when you start getting into more of a mature program, is when you start to build an understanding around the visibility that you have post-compromise. So what happens when an adversary is on your systems? They've gotten around your protection mechanisms, which is what happened at Colonial Pipeline, by the way. Colonial Pipeline, the first thing the malware did from DarkSide was disable McAfee. So it shut down their antivirus software, and all of a sudden they were completely blind to all of the other attacks that happen out there. So do you have centralization of logging and visibility into your environment to look for those other indicators that are out there? Someone had asked, what's your thoughts on from an EDR perspective or an endpoint detection and response tool? An EDR is great from a visibility perspective if you have people actively looking at it and going through it. Having more information is a fantastic thing, but you need to understand how that applies to your environment, understand the behavior that these attackers exhibit, and know that an EDR isn't going to flag on every single attack that's out there, even though the data might still be in those logs. So, it's really about building that out. Yeah, go ahead.
Something we've also seen with the EDRs is the attack, like on my most recent ransomware investigation, it kind of goes into a question Dylan had as well. But they got on access to a system and they spent a day trying to figure out how to get around the EDR. Once they figured out how to actually bypass it, or they had a payload that would get past it, they then spread out to everything. Dylan's question was along the lines of the encryption tool itself. Is it part of a payload? No, actually, the encryption tool a lot of times is its own standalone executable that they push out. Its only task a lot of times is to just do the encryption. All the moving laterally, the dumping like passwords or escalation, most of the time is done through external tools or external scripts. If you think about it as more of like a software dev, if you try to do a all-in-one package, it's more likely to be caught. But if you can do a stripped down encryption tool that's just encrypting, a lot of times you can customize it easily to bypass any type of signature protection.
Someone had a quick question here. James had a question. How could you disable PowerShell machines if an organization uses PowerShell in combination with SCCM to deploy the software? So what we're talking about here, and that's a good question, James, and that's one we actually commonly get, is that we're not talking about disabling PowerShell from the system account or what you would use to run packages or things to that effect. You can also put exceptions in place as well. We're talking about regular users being able to execute PowerShell under the context of their user account. And so, a regular user having access to PowerShell, for example, isn't typically needed. If it is, there are ways you can put exceptions in place to run specific scripts or certain things from different locations, which minimize the ability for those to actually go and execute. So that's one of the ones that I would recommend from that side, is disabling for regular users, not obviously from the system account itself, so that you can still operate and push updates out through SCCM and things to that effect.
There was also a question basically about encrypting like Google Drives. If you have something mapped to a Google Drive or mapped to like a hub or some other type of file share, a lot of times the encryption tools will try to encrypt those as well. So those are available to being encrypted. A lot of times those, like the Google Drives, are locked down a little bit more. So a lot of times you don't just have an individual folder that has thousands of files in it. You have access to the files for that user a lot of times. So it might be a little bit more of a limited attack surface, or at least not attack surface, but just what they can encrypt. So the idea is to encrypt as much of high value as possible, or to data exfil. It's something we kind of skipped over, is kind of some of the trends that we're seeing. And we talked about it earlier. Anymore, it's not just the ransom. They're trying to double or triple dip into the payments. They, like Dave mentioned earlier, they'll come in, they reconnaissance, they find things that are sensitive to you. They will take that and data exfil them prior to the encryption. That way, once you pay the encryption, they'll come back later on and say, well, if you don't want us to leak this information, pay us again. Something else that we also see is they do double encrypt. So they might encrypt part of your network with one key and another part with a different. And the second key, they actually make you pay more for. The public shaming is another one that's recently been happening a lot, is where they'll data exfil and they'll come back to you. And if you don't pay the ransom, they will start posting things about you that you were breached, that you didn't pay the ransom. Here's the sensitive data. And they'll start leaking data online just to kind of turn screws to get you either to pay the ransom or pay to make them quiet down. Something else. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Oh no, there's another question there too. But you go ahead, answer what you were gonna do, then I'll do the other question.
Okay, I was kind of just going through the trends, just some of the things we see.
Oh yeah, go for it.
So also selling a backdoor. So after one ransomware has gotten in and they've got you to pay, they might still have a foothold in your system that they might sell to a different group that will come in and then release ransomware or some type of data or exfil data. So, I mean, they're up for making money any way they can. So if they already have access, they might come back themselves a month later or a year later and then re-encrypt you again because now they know that you pay. Something that more recently is happening. Sometimes insurances are refusing to pay, especially if you've been encrypted before. So that's something to keep in mind if you've already been a victim of an attack. That the second time coming around, that insurance might be a little more hesitant to pay because you might have to prove to them that yes, you got attacked before, but you made changes to your systems that should have stopped it. Something else that we kind of foresee coming up, we haven't seen a lot of it yet, or if any of it yet, is an insider threat, where the attacking groups, they will actually go to somebody that's like a disgruntled employee that's internal and convince them to either leak information or leak keys or maybe improperly patch something that would allow the attackers an access in. And I mean, that's something that's actually kind of pretty hard to prove that somebody internal had that or did that type of access. Sorry, I'm seeing a bunch of questions flip through. So
yeah, I'm responding to them as fast as I can. So someone had asked, please explain the remediation at the host level again. This presentation will be available for everybody to view again. So it'll have all the details that we did on the host side of the house. But if you go to the next slide, it has a lot of the recommendations. Obviously minimization of user rights, multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, disabling RDP for anything externally exposed, disabling PowerShell for regular users. Those are going to be some key things. I'm a huge fan of application control or allow listing. Anytime you can do minimization of applications running on the systems, especially from what we call a living off the land binaries and scripts perspective, which is a big attack surface, and restricting those from regular user accounts, something like regsvr32, which is in your system 32 directory, which allows the ability to download and execute code. That'll be something very big, or MSHTA or MAV-inject or RunDLL32, a number of the ones that are commonly used for remote code execution or local code execution on the system itself. Those are all things that you want to kind of shore up from an attack surface perspective. But I think, really what you want to focus on is minimization of user rights, restricting attack surface through scripting languages. Just disabling macros has a huge impact. So just get rid of macros for crying out loud. Please, if there's one thing you can do from a code execution through an Outlook perspective, it's going to be the macro side of the house. So, there's a lot of common things that you can do on your systems to really remediate some of those.
And as far as like, if you're trying to get your systems back up and running after an attack, some of the things that we talked about earlier would be to go and isolate the system as you build it up, bring it back up in an isolated network. That way that you have increased monitoring so that you know when something is happening or beaconing out. That way you feel safe to bring that back up. You don't want to put it back into a network where you think you're not 100% sure that the attackers aren't still in. So they possibly could just be able to re-attack, especially if you haven't changed passwords or things like that already.
One last one. We have two questions really quick. One is deception type capabilities. I think deception capabilities are great. It's really your last line of defense. You don't want those firing off. That means they've gotten around all your detective controls. But any type of like honey credentials, honey networks, honey systems, can definitely entice an attacker to go after them from a low value perspective and give you some indication. So we've definitely seen some successes there in companies. Over at Binary Defense, our sister company, our MDR platform incorporates deception, which has a number of different deception things built into it. And I can tell you, it makes it super believable for attackers. And we've definitely had a lot of success with those in the past. So definitely apply it. And there's things you can do obviously on your own, but it's also a great thing. One last one before we go, this will be the last question. There's some more. We'll see if we can get through some of those later on. But how effective is application control? Can it be bypassed by renaming the binary? So yeah, there's definitely ways of circumventing application control, especially from a path perspective. What you typically want to look at is how the application control technology works. So a lot of times it'll use the initial path as one point, but it'll also look at everything from like a hashing perspective or code signing certificate, which is more of the more applied approach for those. So keying it off of the code signing certificate and hash is probably the best route to go for those specific areas around application control, application whitelisting. And so those are the things that you typically want to employ. If it's based off of file path, there is a API that you can call that will grab the original source file name. And a lot of the newer technologies will actually pull that to see if something's actually being renamed. But we mostly see those in MDR products, not necessarily on the application control side of the house. But yeah, you can absolutely rename. That's a potential, but it's definitely reducing your attack surface. So if you disallow things like PowerShell, registr32, you disallow living off the lands, how are they going to get the code in there in the first place to get remote command execution to occur? So you have a much better chance of shrinking down that noise and that attack surface with something like allow listing or application control than you would without it. So I'm a huge fan of it. I think it's a great benefit. John, I'm not sure if I'm going to be at GERCON this year. I hope so. It's still kind of up in the air, but we shall see. But that's it for us. I want to thank Scott, Nate, Amanda, Chris, Steve Marshowitz from the TrustedSec side for hopping on here to do this webinar and making it run all smoothly. Thank you all so much for having us on and listening to us for today on talking about ransomware. If you have any questions at all, reach out to us. We're always available at TrustedSec. But thanks again very much. And Scott, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and dropping the knowledge bomb, man.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks, everybody.